Thank you for being here today. Mr. Edwards, we show you registered as Thomas Edwards on behalf of Granite Media Partners, and that you will be testifying neutrally. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Quintero, we show you registered as James Quintero on behalf of Texas Public Policy Foundation, and you will be testifying neutrally. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Clow, we show you registered as Rachel Clow on behalf of KRIS 6 News, and that you will be testifying neutrally. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Awesome. All right, good deal. Thank you. Okay, we'll start with Ms. Clow, if that's okay.
Ooh, I thought I was going last.
No, do you want to go last?
No,
You can go last.
I'm a joker. Sorry.
Okay, that's just my etiquette, whatever.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Clow, and I oversee investigative reporting for KRIS 6 News in Corpus Christi. I'm here to shed light on the critical challenges facing public information access in our local government. Over the past 5 years, I've documented numerous instances where governmental bodies systematically obstruct transparency. Today, I'll focus on my experiences with the City of Corpus Christi, which epitomize the broader issues with public information requests. So last year, our investigative team received text messages from a source. Those text messages were related to the awarding of $2 million to a developer. These are Type B sales tax funds. When we filed a public information request for these messages, which were sent and received by the city manager, the response was deeply troubling. The city initially didn't provide the requested messages. When the records were turned over, the response was incomplete and evasive. And the city manager only acknowledged these existed once he knew we already had them. Throughout the investigation, we also discovered that video from a public meeting had been altered, and documents from public meetings were missing from the city website. And then it continued. So after this initial story, employees from the city confidentially reached out to our station. They were concerned with how taxpayer money was being spent, so we submitted another open records request because these employees told us where to look. I think it's super important to pause here and acknowledge these employees. They're terrified that they are going to lose their job, but they're incredibly concerned about how money is being spent, so they spoke up. So after this second request was submitted, what happened? City staff spent 2 weeks preparing a preemptive 6-page memo that was sent to the city council about our request. It also took the city 2 weeks to turn these over, even though they clearly had the documents ready because they were reviewing them. The city initially claimed that certain credit card statements didn't exist, so we had to file another request, and those statements existed. The city manager changed the city's purchasing policy 1 week after releasing records to our station, and it was like, well, we didn't break any rules, and we fixed the policy. We discovered that the city spent an average of $40,000 per month on food in its last fiscal year. That is up from $10,000 per month in fiscal year 2019. When our reporting highlighted this excessive spending, the city changed how it published its check registers, switching from Excel to a PDF. We also, through this records request, we requested several things, but other documents revealed the city manager hired a friend to run a free weekly fitness event, and that friend was paid every week, even though the event was canceled 40 times. And I can go on and on, but ultimately, these actions and others reveal a systematic approach to preventing meaningful transparency. Governmental bodies weaponize the Attorney General's office to delay the release of information. They create bureaucratic barriers that make accessing public information cost-prohibitive and time-consuming. And when challenged, they modify public access rather than improve transparency. The Public Information Act is not working as intended. There are virtually no meaningful remedies when governmental bodies refuse to comply with transparency requirements. the public's right to know is being undermined. Our station, KRIS 6 News, supports the Texas Sunshine Coalition's agenda. We call for reforms that will close loopholes in public information law, create consequences for government that obstruct transparency, and ensure that public information remains truly public. And I want to note that a year later, I still don't have all of the documents I requested from the city of Corpus Christi. Thank you, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Are there any questions? If not, I have a couple. Obviously, what you've just told us is troubling, right? I mean, because you're a news agency, right? And you obviously have done this before, and you know the rules and laws. So I just wonder, how does an average person who doesn't able to get information, the average taxpayer able to get information if they don't? I guess what I'm saying is, if you can't, who can in these cases?
100%. And I encounter residents weekly who will reach out to our station because one of the main focuses is public information for KRIS 6 News. We recently held 2 workshops on basically how to navigate open government along with the Freedom of Information Foundation. People are constantly running into governmental bodies that just don't turn over information, don't seek an attorney general's opinion, and they don't know what to do. The law is cumbersome. The number of exemptions is obsessive. It's excessive.
So you go and you, in this particular case, but it's probably true in other cases, you go and you ask for this information and whatever, there's 10 days, supposedly, right? 10 business days.
Well, it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be if it's readily available, provided immediately.
Sure. They're supposed to, but it's a year later and you still don't have it. So as you're going through this process, besides obvious frustration, who did you go to for help? I mean, did you try and contact the city managers there and say, hey, where is it? What's going on? Did you go to the Attorney General's office and ask them for help? I mean, what do you do when the deadline has passed?
So we have done all of that. The problem is when you go to the Attorney General and you say, I have a problem because this governmental body is refusing to turn over information, then what happens is the Attorney General sends a certification to the governmental body who just has to say, I turned it over, whether they did or they did not, right? So I know that records exist that they refuse to turn over, but that's it. That's my only remedy. I can file suit, but media doesn't have the money. Taxpayers certainly don't have the money to file suit.
So in that particular case where you didn't get the records, do you have access to that certification to be able to say, they're saying, they being the government entity is saying we sent it, do you get to see that certification at all?
Yes, we receive a copy of the certification. Okay. But again, as soon as I receive that certification, my complaint is closed with the Attorney General.
Okay. And then what do you do?
And then you keep fighting. Very often, what I've done as a journalist is I found other ways to get the information, sure. But very often the public gives up.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. Okay, Representative Rodriguez-Ramos, and Tony, and then, no.
Many state agencies are increasingly outsourcing to private contractors, for private companies. So what do you do in those situations where there's taxpayer dollars being funneled to different private entities, and the question is still in terms of transparency, how those funds are being best utilized and how to report back to taxpayers? So what do you do in those situations?
So the Texas Public Information Act still allows us to request those documents, but it can get tricky, right? Very often in those contracts, it states that the information is public, but when you're dealing with a contracted agency, we're not always going to get everything. And so I would think a provision that makes that information public would be helpful.
A provision
in state law
that makes, okay, so if you have difficulty getting information from state agencies, I imagine it's 10 times harder to get it from private companies who contract with state agencies.
I am going to say that the reporting that I do is hyper local, right? So from a state agency perspective, the limited amount that I've requested has been fairly forthcoming, but I'm not doing intensive investigative projects into state agencies.
Okay. Have you had any projects with private companies that contract with state agencies?
Yes, so 2 years ago, we launched an investigation into wrong-way drivers on the Harbor Bridge after we discovered that several people had died due to wrong-way drivers. That project is a TxDOT project, and Flatiron Dragados is the company that is overseeing the project.
Okay.
So we went through an extensive process, which we ended up needing to get legal help for because they refused to release records. Ultimately, they did, and it took us months. The governor got involved and said that TxDOT's response was inadequate, finally forcing the closure of multiple exits. But at the end of the day, it took us months.
Right. And I imagine that's where litigation comes in with discovery requests, and it just can be even more expensive and daunting.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Tinderholt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to first say I'm sorry that happened. These documents and these open meetings and the records are actually yours. Like, we work for you and we work for the people that are watching today, and we're honored to do it. But these documents are essentially yours, and they should be a lot easier to get. You know, we get reports of people that are asking for documents and they're charged exorbitant amounts of money per page just to try to mitigate people asking. When we do our reports that we're going to have to do, I want you to realize we have to be careful not to be so heavy-handed with whatever we recommend, because there are people that purposely try to overwhelm some people with these requests and hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of pages of documents. But I agree, and I'm glad that you're here, and I'm glad you brought this up, because this stuff needs to be fixed, and there needs to be teeth to hold elected officials in the offices and the cities accountable when people ask. And so I'm sorry that happened. I don't know if maybe having your local your elected official at the state level, maybe the senator and state rep, write a letter. But I'm beside myself that you're a year later and you can't get these documents. I don't understand it. It should be easy, unless potentially somebody's hiding something. So thank you for bringing that here today. I think it's really important for us to hear these in person versus someone telling us that someone told him that someone else told him that this stuff's happening. So thank you.
Representative Troxclair.
So do you have specific recommendations of what can be done in order to help address this problem?
Absolutely. And I know that, so I'm kind of new at this process, so I understand that I cannot mention specific bills or that's not allowed, right? That's what I was told. Oh, I can. Well,
Yeah.
I didn't
You
write
say
them
whatever you
down
want.
and I don't have that great of a memory. But the Texas Sunshine Coalition, I support all of their recommendations. There are, sorry, I'm blanking.
It's okay.
There are.
We don't remember bill numbers either, don't we?
Yeah.
From an open government perspective, there are recommendations to allow for disputes to be handled by a third-party mediator. And I love that idea. And it would also open up the opportunity for a SOA judge to hear it, and that would close it quicker, and it would allow these issues to be resolved quicker with less cost to the taxpayer or media organizations. And so that's one that I really hope we can push forward.
Okay, thank you.
Members, any other questions? Okay, if not, thank you for your testimony. If you stay there, we're going to go to Mr. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. Thank you all for letting us be here today. I'm Thomas Edwards, and today I am the executive editor of Granite Media Partners. We represent 13 newspapers that we either own or manage. We are the Heartland newspapers. We're still your small-town suburban weeklies. We still cover the Kiwanis Club, the Church Social. We do hunting and fishing guides. We report on what the Rotary Club's up to. Not too long ago, Representative Troxclair was on the front page twice of one of my papers, the Bernie Star, when she stopped by to talk to some folks. But we also cover law enforcement. And before I came to Granite, I also worked for the big boys. I've worked for Hearst, News Corps, Clear Channel, for the Express News in San Antonio. And so I think that I can probably speak across the board for one issue that keeps coming up with all of our newspapers, and that's the release of birth dates. We keep running into walls when we cover crime news, and I was a crime reporter for 20 years, with legislation that prevents us from access to birth dates. Now, I'm not clear on the history of it. I think it happened back in 2009, something like that. Releasing birth dates is not an invasion of privacy. It's an act of clarity and information. For instance, not too long ago, we had a cement truck driver in Bastrop County collide with a school bus from Hayes Consolidated ISD. A young child was killed, and then a student, I believe, from Texas State University was also killed in the accident. Now, the Department of Public Safety did a great job in releasing information to us, but their hands were tied. And when we got to the suspect's or defendant's name, his name was quite a common name. And as we tried to investigate and delve deeper into his driving record, prior case histories, if he'd ever been in jail before, convicted, we were not given a DOB. And when we get police reports, DOBs are redacted. Now, we want to be able to tell the public exactly who is being detained, whose civil liberties are being withheld, who's being charged, who's being investigated by the state, but it's also as a method of protection. What if you had the same name as a defendant? And so let's just say you go to your place of business a couple days later, and we've written about somebody else with the same name who's charged with sexual assault of a child. That can actually lead to a lot of problems for you. And I've actually been at newspapers where, because there was no date of birth released, there have been mistakes and the wrong picture has been pulled from the wrong file and run in the paper. And some of you might be members of the bar. You know that lawsuits, libel suits, defamation suits are incredibly expensive. It also puts a chilling effect on relationships between us and law enforcement. Most of the time when we deal with the sheriff's office, the police agency, DPS, they want to release this information, but their hands are bound. What I would urge is that for whatever reason, we pull back on not releasing dates of birth, and we go back to making those part of the permanent police records that can be released to the public. It will end a lot of confusion and even some heartache. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, any questions on that? If not, thank you. Mr. Quintero.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is James Quintero. I represent the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I want to thank you for not only the opportunity to speak today, but also for all the good work ahead. I can tell you that voters are eager for something just like this here in Texas. And I say that on the basis of some recent Rasmussen polling data, which shows that voters are paying more attention to news about DOGE cutting government spending than they are about wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine. So I think the eyes of Texas are definitely upon this committee, and I wish you well. When considering the committee's jurisdiction, two things occurred to me. One is that y'all have an opportunity to enact some far-reaching changes. The jurisdiction is quite broad. But it also, I think, presents a challenge to both find a focus or at least provide some intentional directions to your efforts. And so what I thought I would do, at least within the transparency context, is offer up a few policy proposals that are anchored in transparency, but maybe add a bit more in terms of accountability and efficiency as well. And so as you'll see in your handout, I've got 5 policy proposals that I want to offer up for the committee's consideration. Very quickly, and I won't bore you to death with all the details, but very quickly, those policy proposals are to strengthen the Texas Public Information Act, to reimagine the Office of State-Federal Relations, to establish some measure of oversight over special purpose districts, to create a database of local regulatory adjustments that have been made as a result of the passage of the Texas Regulatory Consistency Act. And then the last one is to perhaps consider reviving an old effort that was instituted by then Governor Ronald Reagan, which was a California-based commission to investigate the whole of government. And so very quickly, I want to go through each one of those. And again, I won't take up too much of your time because I know you have a long day in front of you. This month, I actually celebrate 17 years with the foundation, which is actually really terrifying. But I say that to make note of the fact that I have sent a lot of Texas Public Information Act requests over the years. In fact, too many to count. And in my experience, the TPIA has gotten noticeably worse over that time. And I would say probably since about 2015 onward has gotten noticeably worse. The law right now is plagued by non-responsiveness, long delays, exorbitant cost estimates, excessive redactions, and my favorite, lots of unsearchable electronic information provided in PDF form that takes me way more time than it should to transcribe into something readable and searchable. Now, in my experience grappling with these things, one of the things that's occurred to me and that I most recently wrote about is the fact that we have far too many exceptions in the law. So when the Texas Open Records Act was initially established in the 1970s, the law was created with only about 15 different exceptions. Today, that number stands at about 75. So we've added a tremendous amount of carve-outs to the law that really withhold data and documents that rightfully belong to the public. Now you're probably wondering, well, which are the good ones and which are the bad ones? If you take note of a recent document that I published, I believe in November of 2024, I actually worked through all 75 different exceptions to identify those that ought to be amended, those that ought to be kept, and those that we should do away with. And I can tell you that I took a heavy hand to those non-public safety related exceptions that were included in the law, and I recommended a lot of those for elimination. So if anybody's interested, I've got a laundry list of those, and I'd be happy to share that with the committee. That's, of course, one of the chief recommendations that I have under the first goal is to examine the exceptions that are in the law and take aim at those that no longer serve any legitimate function. Because again, I think we have to get back to a place where we've restored the presumption of openness in the law, and we've clearly gotten away from that. Another item under Goal 1 that I want to recommend for consideration is to amend the statutory definition in the TPIA so as to include nonprofit state associations and organizations. What I think is happening right now is we have a lot of taxpayer-funded lobbying activity occurring at the Capitol, and part of what is facilitating that activity is you have these third-party organizations that are largely funded by our tax dollars, but that operate out of public scrutiny. And so there are two bills currently up that have been proposed, SB 758 and HB 2388. I hope to be back in front of your committee later this year testifying in support of those measures. But I think amending that statutory definition to apply the TPIA to entities of that type would really go far to expand the transparency tools that the public desperately needs. Moving on to Goal 2, again, very quickly. One of the chief concerns that I have right now is that we have a lot of federal monies flowing through the system. In fact, the LBB reports that as of November 2024, $85.5 billion of pandemic-related aid now flows through Texas governments, or at least has since Congress acted back in the early 2020s. That is a lot of federal money to inject into the system. And what the economic literature suggests is that when the national government provides funding to subnational governments, there's a tendency for something known as the flypaper effect, which is that these monies have a sticky quality to them. And so when you see the influx of such a tremendous volume of federal monies into the system, there ought to be great concern that these monies will lead to the continuing programs and personnel that were really intended only to be one time. And so to get a handle on this, what we can do, I think, is to borrow from some prior efforts, both at the Texas legislative level and that were actually enacted by then Governor Mike Pence in the early 2013s. What Governor Pence did is he effectively reimagined his own Office of State and Federal Relations to make it more of a clearinghouse. It's more of an organ of state government that provides transparency and oversight with respect to federal grant monies so as to prevent the duplication of services, redundancies, and make sure that those monies that are being spent at the state and local level are well coordinated and serve some legitimate public interest. I think the body ought to consider something like that. That would add a tremendous amount of additional scrutiny and oversight into the system. Again, we have a lot of money flowing in from the national government, but really no oversight mechanism. The third goal, and this one is near and dear to my heart, I truly believe we need to establish some measure of state oversight of our special purpose districts. So when you consider the local government landscape, what you see is we have about 4,500 local governmental entities in this state. That's a tremendous number. In fact, there's some research from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis that suggests we have the second highest number of governmental entities anywhere in the nation, only behind Illinois, right? And so when you consider that 4,500 number, what you have to consider is that about half of those are special purpose districts. These are supposed to be entities that are created for a particular purpose. Right? There's a problem, like a lot of crime in an area, and so the legislature or some other state mechanism acts to create a crime control district. The problem is these districts get created and then forgotten about. And what happens over time is you have layers upon layers upon layers of government that are created and perhaps serving no particular purpose. So what I would encourage the committee to do is to create some state oversight mechanism to investigate special purpose districts and determine three things. One, are they still fulfilling a legitimate public purpose, or has that original problem been solved? And if so, perhaps we can get rid of it. Two, is the entity in question still primarily focused on its original purpose, or has there been some level of mission creep so as to justify its continued existence? And then three, what avenues, if any, exist to right-size that entity? So, for me, I think the natural thing that comes to mind and that's within the committee's jurisdiction is to perhaps consider providing this function to the Sunset Advisory Commission, creating some sort of special department or oversight mechanism therein so that we can get a handle on our special purpose districts and perhaps even begin to lower the property tax burden as a result. The fourth goal that I'll recommend, and I'll provide a bit of a story. So during the big Death Star bill fight last year, one of the things that came to light in a Dallas Morning News article was the fact that the city of Dallas had provided a policymaker with a set of 100 different rules, ordinances, and regulations that were potentially subject or quote unquote endangered by the passage of the law. When I read that in the newspaper, I thought, shucks, I would like to see that. And so thus began a long fight with the city of Dallas involving a TPIA request to get that information that they had provided to a policymaker. I won't bore you with the long story, but eventually I got a hold of this information, but it took me about a year to do so. What I think this information provides, and why I believe they were intent on withholding it from me, is there are so many different rules, regulations, and ordinances that should be pared back but are not in the city of Dallas, and that experience could be expanded elsewhere to all of our other 1,000 plus cities. Why I mention all of this is because I think the state has an opportunity now that the Death Star bill fight is over. We have an opportunity to highlight some of the regulatory reforms and rollbacks that should be happening in our cities and counties, right? We have this great new preemption measure to get cities and counties back to the basics, the state ought to be highlighting and elevating the changes that have been made and the impact to ratepayers and taxpayers because of the law. I can tell you based on the experience, based on some recent experience, that to my knowledge, no city or county has really made any changes on the basis of HB 2127. And I say that, and I provide some information to that effect. I believe that's in Appendix B. I recently surveyed about 20 different cities. I sent them all the same question. I wanted to know, what have you done as a result of the passage of this law? Every single one of them came back and said, well, we really haven't done anything, or there's no information responsive to your request, right? So my hope is that if the state were to create some sort of scoreboard or some sort of mechanism by which to communicate to the public what the Death Star bill has done, we would not only prompt our local governmental entities to finally act on what is good state law, but we would also encourage the dissemination of that information and perhaps plant some seeds for folks in other areas, which would then help further spread that regulatory rollback. So number 5, last one, I promise I'll be quick. This one pertains to an idea that first took root when then Governor Reagan championed something known as the Survey on Efficiency and Cost Control. This was a state-based effort when he was governor to really get the private sector involved in finding efficiencies. It was his effort to bring in some outside set of eyes to really dig in and figure out, can we do government better, right? And one of the reasons that I put forward this particular item is I know you guys are wholly invested in this effort, and I look forward to the great product that you will put forward. I don't know that 60 days is necessarily enough time to go through the whole of government. And it might be worth setting up a committee of this type led by private sector partners to investigate the state government primarily, but perhaps even local government, and figure out, can we apply both the things, the efficient mechanisms that we have in private industry, along with automation and technology, to really bring down the cost of government and move things in a better direction. If anybody's interested, Appendix C actually has the original executive order from Governor Reagan. Perhaps it provides some ideas to move us further in that direction, but I look forward to being a resource, and I want to thank you guys for your time.
Great. Thank you. Any questions? Anybody? No. Well, first of all, I just agree in general what everyone said. I mean, it's completely ridiculous that government agencies, especially today, are not providing the data that's owned by the taxpayers to the taxpayers. And given how far technology has gone and how readily accessible the data is, I mean, it's completely ludicrous that some people are printing out Excel spreadsheets, scanning them, and turning them into PDFs. Just let all those government entities know ChatGPT can read it just fine. So just get us the data quickly and cheaply, and we do want to work on this not just for the next 60 days, but for the rest of the year, but only in session until June is the goal. So anyway, any other questions? Yeah, Representative Cook.
Yeah, I just wanted to see it from the media perspective. Have either one of y'all filed an official or formal complaint with the district attorney's office? They have 30 days to respond. Have y'all gone through that process? And
So while I have not filed an official complaint, a resident in Corpus Christi did file an official complaint with the Nueces County District Attorney. And the response from the district attorney is, I am not an investigatory agency, so I can't look into your complaint, even though I'm the proper person that would prosecute it. So basically, we kind of go around in circles at times.
well, no, after you do that, then you go to the Attorney General's office.
Correct, and so this individual has gone to the Attorney General.
Did they get a response from the Attorney
They
General's
have not
office?
yet gotten a response.
How long has that taken?
It's been several months.
And has it been acknowledged? Has there been a written response from the Attorney General?
I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure it was acknowledged. But again, there are multiple issues because the Attorney General's office is overwhelmed, right? When governmental entities are sending things to the AG that they know should be public, and the AG has to review each of these. Thousands and thousands and thousands of these items are going to the Attorney General.
Well, there's different things. You're
Right.
talking about at the beginning. I mean, yeah,
Right.
the city can send a letter to the Attorney General. That's not the same thing as this complaint process. Filing a formal complaint, there are not. I would speculate there's not thousands and thousands of complaints being filed.
But I'm saying in general, the Attorney General's office is overwhelmed.
It's, we don't know that. I mean, maybe in certain areas. I mean, in the
Right.
child support office, I would agree with you
Right.
that they are overwhelmed in child support collection. But in these formal complaints that are set up, I would strongly doubt that they're overwhelmed. And so I just think people need to make sure that they're following the process. It's surprising to me that a district attorney that has investigators on staff would say that they don't have a duty to investigate matters. And so they have 30 or 31 days to respond, and if they don't, then you go to the Attorney General's office. So I would just make sure that people are following those, and if the Attorney General's office is not, then that's when, as representatives of whatever the district is, I think that's when we should get in on behalf of the individual and help. So I just want to make sure that side is being told as well. So thank you.
May I say-
Yes.
Mr. Cook, I would also like to say that, I hope you can hear me, I think this thing turned off.
Yeah,
But
okay.
there's just the chill of big government. My papers are small town papers, and like I said, they're heartland papers. A lot of you are probably in their districts, but we have small staffs. There's a sheriff's office that refuses to release mugshots to us of booking suspects. That's public record. And when they come to us and say, well, that's just our policy, we don't always have the time, the money, or the resources to pursue a complaint with the AG's office for something that should come to us. The laws already exist for these things to happen. It would be good to have additional measures in place to bring these government agencies to heel for not doing the business of the people. Our job is to watch government. We were enshrined to watch you. We're in the Constitution. We're the Bill of Rights, First Amendment. So we were created to be your watchdogs. So these shouldn't be problems for us because we represent your constituents, your voters, your taxpayers. We're their eyes and ears. So anything you can do to help us would be great.
But most of the time, it's going to be enforcement. I mean, like right now, if these people are not following, I mean, you can have a criminal complaint, a criminal action can be brought for the failure to respond properly to these actions. And so I think Ms. Troxclair asked earlier, if you have specific recommendations, bring those. But I think a lot of these problems that I'm hearing are enforcement mechanisms that aren't being followed. So
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
We have another question, but can you just double check to make sure that I can't see from here, but is it red or is it green or none of the above?
That turned off?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I hope we
Okay.
didn't skip.
Is that one also? No.
This one's good.
Okay, that one's good. Maybe switch that over. All right, Representative Rodriguez Ramos.
The question is for you, Mr. Edwards. Pardon me. Is it in statute that you're saying that the different entities are not releasing date of births, and that's where we need to look at to the press?
Yes, Representative. My understanding is it was a law that was passed several years ago, and whether it's statutory or not, it's become a practice.
Okay.
And I have reviewed several police reports now where those are always redacted, and it's frustrating. My career as a crime reporter, I worked 15 years as a crime reporter for the San Antonio Express News. We got date of births immediately. We got offense reports immediately. Today, there's just a big chill.
Okay.
We had recently a murder-suicide in Hutto, and while we got a terse, nice press release from the Hutto Public Information Officer, and the police chief came out and gave a quick press conference. If you miss that press conference, you are out of luck. And I believe there's a case where the Houston Chronicle got established as precedent. But there are massive amounts of information that can be released from a police offense report. We're not talking about witnesses' names. We're not talking about confessions or statements from a defendant, just basic information, whether it was night or day, time, address, a brief description of the incident from the officer, the complainant's name, complainant's age, defendant or arrested person's name and age. Today, it is like pulling teeth sometimes to get this information. And if you have a relative who has the same name as a defendant, you want to make very sure that in the newspaper or the television station, radio broadcast, online news site, that we get the right person named with the right age so that there's no confusion and embarrassment brought to your family, your relatives, your institution, or your business. And we're all about clarity and transparency. We just need the government to do the same for us.
And speaking of the date of birth, did you put Ellen Troxclair's date of birth on the on the cover of those papers that she was on the front? Just kidding.
No, we did not.
I'm kidding.
In fact,
We'll
she
talk about
was,
that
to be
later.
honest, she was very amenable to my reporter.
Wonderful.
Gave a good interview. So, but we would do the same for a Democrat too, because we're not political. We don't do endorsements. We just cover the news. That's all.
Is it possible, or is it probable or likely that some of these agencies don't? Has it changed here recently with your social media, maybe your online press people or whatever they call themselves, that they gather information, maybe utilize it to exploit or to how do these agencies, let's say the sheriff's office, know or is able to make sure that it's a reputable agency versus somebody who says, I am with the press, but it's my podcast that I have or what have you, and that maybe share some information that's, or skew it a certain way that is not credible or not, it's not a reputable source?
That is a great question. Today, almost any person can say they're a journalist because of social media, but just like people who take the bar exam, just like people who go to medical school, those of you who are in IT, you have proper credentials and training. Most of us go through training too. We work for legitimate, recognized news organizations. And in our local communities, most of our government entities know that. What's more is through the Texas Press Association, we get recognized press credentials and press badges. I didn't put mine on, but it's sitting right back there in the bag. And so you can know the difference. Right now, thanks to the explosion of online media, there are so many choices for information. That doesn't always mean it's great information. There is, we verify, fact check, do corroboration, try to get as many voices in the story that we can, as opposed to some blogger who just sits there and spews out, invective.
Right.
That's the difference.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you. God, I hope I didn't break it. Oh, there you go. Thank you. I think it worked.
Great, thank you. Representative Troxclair.
Yeah, Mr. Quintero, I had some follow-up questions related to your goal number 4. I am so interested to see your reports of the Public Information Acts about what cities are doing to be responsive to, the Death Star bill. I noticed that you do mention that cities are suing over it. Do we know when we're expected to have a resolution on those court cases?
It's a great question. So for those of you who may not be familiar, shortly after the passage of the Death Star bill, some very progressive cities initiated litigation against the new law, contending that it was unconstitutional. And they actually took their case to the Travis County District Court and found a favorable outcome. That case was immediately appealed to, I believe, the Third Court of Appeals, where it still rests. My guess is that it will eventually need to be settled by the Texas Supreme Court. That timeline, though, is unclear to me. Given the circumstances, one of the things that I think the body ought to take into note is the fact that at least within the Travis County District Court's jurisdiction, that ruling holds, but outside of that jurisdiction, HB 2127 is still good law as far as I understand. And yet we have cities and counties that are non-responsive to that law, choosing which parts to follow. And I think that's a very concerning set of events that the body ought to take notice of.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, because that was my question was, is there something to do with the lawsuits that would be a reason behind these cities having non-responsive responses to your public information requests? So if that is not the case, at least outside of the Travis County area, I'm just remembering back, like, we were told that the sky was going to fall, that gosh, these cities were going to be destroyed, and that they were going to be without the ability to regulate development and to do, protect workers and do just everything under the sun. And hence, it became, the media coined it Death Star, right? That is how that name came to be. I don't think the original bill author, Speaker Burrows, didn't start out with that name. And considering the ample opposition that we did see to that bill, in large part because of the taxpayer-funded lobbyists that you mentioned, I am really shocked to learn that there doesn't seem to be a single city that had to make any changes at all. So either the narrative that was spread far and wide, into every corner of the state about the detrimental effects that this bill would have, either that was untrue, or the cities are willingly not following the law. And I'm increasingly concerned about this because it seems to be a pattern, not just with this bill, but with other laws passed by the state that the cities or the school districts or whoever the case may be, they just choose not to do it. And then we are left with no recourse but to go through a lengthy legal process. So at what point do we have to question where are the enforcement mechanisms? Where are the consequences for not following state law? We have a system of government that is set up the way that it's set up for a reason, right? That constitutionally the powers are set aside for the state, and yet this has come up in several of my recent conversations. And so one of your recommendations is to task a state agency with documenting which regulations are being reduced or eliminated as a result of the Death Star bill. And my question is twofold. First of all, do you have a state agency in mind that you think that would be a good fit? And number two, why should we limit this to just the Death Star bill? I've received other complaints about laws not being enforced. So what can we do differently to make sure that the time and energy that we spend up here to make sure that this state is free and prosperous, that those laws are actually followed?
What a terrific question. I've long been frustrated with what appears to be a growing sense of lawlessness at the local level. And you can see that that mindset take root, whether it's with respect to non-responsiveness of TPIA requests, whether it's choosing not to follow SB 2038, which was the ETJ reform that y'all passed last year, whether it's not following HB 2127 at all. Right? There seems to be this mentality at the local level that is deeply concerning and really calls into question what it is that we're doing here, because the legislature, you guys, invest so much time, energy, and resources into getting policy right, only for it to be ignored at the local level. I think that is deeply concerning. And so one of the things that we're asking the body to consider that's not reflected in this document, but is to consider re-empowering the Attorney General to hold political subdivisions to account when they violate the law. It shouldn't be left to individuals alone to risk their time, money, and reputation, making sure that cities, counties, and the rest are following laws that have been passed by the state. The state ought to have its own enforcement mechanism to make sure that we're all behaving well. And so that's one thing that I would put forward. As far as the state agency, tasked with tracking progress on HB 2127. The Texas Controller's Office comes to mind first. And the reason why is because they have the ability to, I think, do some excellent work with respect to economics, right? They can very quickly take in, digest, and relay what the fiscal impact or what the economic impact is as a result of the reduction or elimination of certain regulations, and perhaps political subdivisions can even help in that regard too. By the way, again, there are at least, in our big cities, there is lots of room for reduction and reform. The city of Dallas identified at least 100 endangered regulations. You can only imagine the sort of right sizing and cost reduction that is possible if they were to adjust their scope as required by law, right? If cities are required to only to really get back to the basics and stop chasing progressive ideals or concepts, then I think they have lots more resources available to devote to core functions and or return back to the taxpayer. And so I think there's tremendous potential with respect to the law, but it has to be followed.
I would love to continue brainstorming with you because I know that you have given a lot of time and energy as well to our tax policy and ways and means issues. And it occurs to me that there could be penalties triggered for noncompliance with state law by maybe just defaulting to the no new revenue rate or automatic audits being triggered or things like that. And when it comes to ISDs, of course, there's a significant state role in their funding as well. And so I think we need to start getting serious about making sure that the laws are followed in our state. And I would love to follow up with you and brainstorm some more ways to make that happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Thank you. Representative Rodriguez-Ramos.
Yes, looking at your notes
I'm sorry.
here.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Sorry. my bad.
Thank you. Looking at your notes here, you have your, it says here, I don't know, it's not numbered, but the lawsuit with this Death Star bill, it's still
Yes, ma'am.
going, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So, following the law, I mean, are you not suggesting that the court still, that we remove the court's ability to interpret what the law means?
No, ma'am. I think
Okay.
but
because
the jury.
the court did, and you put here in the notes, the court did say that it was entirely unconstitutional. So you're not suggesting that we circumvent the courts and just enforce something without the court's interpretation or without the court making the final decision, right?
The district court's ruling is limited to its own jurisdiction, so any other political subdivision that's not in that jurisdiction should
Is
still
that what
follow
the
the
district,
law.
Is that what the district court said? There's not a state stay?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So, but you are still, so when you're talking about following the law, so what you're saying is these states who, these cities, several other cities who are part of this underlying lawsuit, I mean, we're still recommending that we follow the courts and let the courts decide ultimately what the interpretation or implementation of the law is going to be, correct?
Yes, ultimately, the courts
Okay.
will have to interpret. Now, one thing that I
Thank
think
you.
is very clearly communicated with respect to the TPIA responses that are in Appendix B is that cities and counties have no intent of following the law, even though they are still subject to it. And I would point you to the city of El Paso's response, where it says that, you know, per the city clerk's office, HB 2127 was presented back at June 5th, 2023. There was no action taken, no documentation on the legislative repository related to HB 2127, right? So they were presented with the law shortly after the conclusion of the 2023 session, decided not to take action, even though it went into effect shortly thereafter, and are still subject to it.
Well, and the courts will decide that, right? Yes. Thank you.
Representative Kane.
We've got court cases, that are enjoining certain provisions of state law and code. Are you familiar? Is there a central depository of those? Is there a place? When you're looking at needing a place for this data, I'm also wondering is there a place that tells us that? Are you familiar with that? Is there a central location where we can go? this section of code is enjoined in this district court or in this court?
That's a good question. So, Chairman, I'm not an attorney, so you best.
Yeah, I don't think you have to be a lawyer to know that one.
No, I would not to my knowledge, but
Would it be helpful? I mean, if you could review?
I believe so. Yes, sir.
That's all. Thanks.
Members, are there any other question? Okay, well, I would say, obviously, you heard that this committee is focused on making sure that we improve transparency for everyone, and I think it's worth noting that this committee is the only committee so far that in its organizational hearing has had public testimony, right? We want to maintain transparency for everyone and everything, and so we look forward to helping you all and you helping us as well. Just have one little last question. You had said, Mr. Edwards, that you used to be able to get information, but recently, or more recently, you haven't. Is there anything in particular that has changed how or why government entities have gone from it being more transparent to not?
Mr. Chairman, I just think it's just a type of pervasive chill that has occurred over the last few years. We have HIPAA, we have, I hate to say it, but bear tree, people chasing down people to file personal injury lawsuits. I think that the law enforcement agencies I deal with, they're trying to do their best. They're trying to follow the law, so they're trying to be extra careful and make sure they don't overstep any boundaries. Back in the 80s and the 90s, the cops I dealt with, they were really great to work with. They didn't have all these restrictions, these things that hamstrung them. And of course, even then, things weren't always super great between, all the time between reporters and police. But at the San Antonio Police Department, I worked there 5 days a week. I actually ended up running out with detectives to crime scenes. We built a great relationship, but it was a different time of day then where often we worked together. I'm one of only 2 reporters in the history of the San Antonio Police Department that got an award from them for helping solve some homicides. So it was a different time. Today there just seems to be this pervasive chill, and government agencies seem to be very reluctant to help out. As our friend from the Texas Public Policy Foundation pointed out, there also seems to be just a flagrant not paying attention or not following state law. I don't just do crime stories. Our headquarters is in Taylor. For our 13 newspapers that stretch from East Texas to Alpine. We've got Samsung out there. We have people trying to opt out of the ETJs, but we've got local governments seemingly almost trying not to pay attention to the laws you all have passed about de-annexation or disannexation. And on the local level, there really does sometimes they seem to almost want to flaunt their nose at Austin.
All right, well, thank you for that. Clapping. All right, so that concludes, thank you for your time. Appreciate your testimony.
Of course.
All right, that concludes today's testimony on open government matters. We will now move on to our conversation on agency operations. If there's one thing this committee can do on efficiencies is lower the air conditioning in this